Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 91st audio file in the audiocast series known as the Q News Patriot. I am the Q News Patriot. My name is SGAnon. Patriots, it is quite exciting to come back on air with each of you for today's file, the content of which I think will be both compelling and thought-provoking as we all sift and sort through this ongoing cultural world war for the heart and destiny of mankind. You know, it almost sounds a bit cliche or even boring by now, doesn't it? This idea of a worldwide conflict that involves multilateral alliances, military and civilian pulpits of power, political arenas, and more. Just 10 years ago, such a claim would have gotten me laughed off the internet with some level of gusto. And yet, from the first Trump presidency to the live action continuity of government exercise that followed, and even as recently as this month, April of 2025, we have a growing body of evidence to suggest that this is indeed the kind of shadow structure landscape that is currently forcing the exposure and death of the Luciferian deep state swamp around the planet. President Trump's own actions over these last 100 days speak volumes in support of this, with executive orders on everything from military and civilian law enforcement cooperation to trade, economy, fiscal policy, education, and others, effectively winding the gears of the largest trap to ever be sprung closed in the history of the United States. Remember, Patriots, by the time all is said and done, more than a dozen active wartime national emergencies, which have been going on a continuous and expanding basis since September of 2001, must be declared officially resolved and concluded by the President of the United States, which will then pave the way for the absorption of the defunct U.S. corporation into the lawful American Republic. Our file today is not terribly long, Patriots, but there's a lot for us to unpack. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'd like to start off our talk today, Patriots, by letting each of you know that this file will be the first one where you will hear a short, narrated advertisement test run recorded by myself, which will go directly towards supporting the files and the overall QNP mission. Today's file will have only one of these, and if you'd like to skip over that blurb, a few taps of the fast forward function will do the trick. But I would ask each of you to give some of them the old college try every now and again as we go forward. We'll get to our blurb here shortly, but first, let's talk about the U.S. Army and Dr. Anthony Fauci. For those who might remember, around 2 years ago, in fact, it was right around the time the audio files became a serious geopolitical podcast, I was invited on air as a guest on a separate broadcast where I claimed that witch Dr. Anthony Fauci was being investigated by the U.S. military for his participation in war crimes while occupying a position of unelected public office, and that the reason for the military's overlap into the activities of his agency was because those war crimes were made possible by the agency's ability to interface with DoD biological compartments inside the Pentagon. I went so far as to say that those investigations would likely lead back to Ukraine, along with the multi-agency biological threat reduction activities happening there, and would also overlap with civilian sector investigations into public corruption and criminal conduct by other government officials over a period of more than 2 decades. Well, Patriots, we now have confirmation by way of declassified U.S. Army documents from earlier this month that at least part of that information I relayed was accurate and almost 2 years ahead of public acknowledgement timeframes. The documents show that the U.S. Army has been investigating Dr. Fauci for purposefully crafting a false public media narrative to conceal gain-of-function research, aka biological weapons activities outside of the provisions of the Geneva Convention. Furthermore, the release of these documents, which did not indicate an end to those investigations, by the way, suggest that further information has likely already been obtained in the Army's investigative efforts, and that the information contained in these documents themselves can no longer impact the trajectory of those other investigations. As far as I'm concerned, this is all the proof we need, Patriots, that certain persons having an intimate involvement or a foreknowledge in the biological terrorism and war crimes committed through COVID-19 crossed their own Rubicon away from protected due process civilians to militarized terrorists and enemy combatants by way of their participation in those activities. What I find absolutely fascinating with this is that the report, which was discussed by News Nation recently and referenced by former CDC Director Robert Redfield, came only 5 days after U.S. Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll was made acting director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which we talked about in File 89 as being both an important operational junction and a database treasure chest for any entity, civilian or military, seeking to track and trace illegal weapons activities. Secretary Driscoll not only took over FBI Director Patel's position after Patel occupied the post for less than 8 weeks, but upon doing so, he immediately flew to U.S. Army Garrison Wiesbaden in Germany. This is a U.S. military base located in the south central area of the country, which houses the Army's Security Assistance Group Ukraine, as well as the NATO Security Assistance and Training Center for Ukraine Command. With the recent release of the Army's documents we were just talking about, I find this bridge at Wiesbaden between the U.S. Army, NATO intelligence, and Ukrainian representatives to be profoundly interesting, Patriots. Many of you might recall that it was the traitor to humankind Barack Hussein Obama who led a delegation to Kiev, Ukraine in 2005 for purposes of signing an agreement between the U.S. government, the Pentagon, and the Ukrainian government to reactivate several Soviet-era chemical warfare research sites using Ukrainian jurisdiction, but U.S. money and DoD capabilities to do it. Later on, it was none other than the U.S. Army's 1st Battalion, 214th Aviation Regiment, based out of Wiesbaden Army Garrison, Germany, that provided the military's aerial escorts for Obama's Air Force One entourage when he was traveling to the European continent as president in 2013 and 14. Among the destinations that the Army's aviators escorted him to was a 2014 European Union summit in Brussels, Belgium, where Obama delivered remarks regarding Russia's annexation of Crimea just 1 month after the CIA-inspired coup in Maidan. I think it's worth asking in this day and time, Patriots, what the U.S. Army's Wiesbaden Intelligence Detachment may have overheard or been privy to as a result of this close security relationship with the now disgraced president more than 10 years ago. Back to today, though, the Security Assistance Group Ukraine and the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, both embedded at Wiesbaden Garrison, coordinate and oversee between the two of them nearly the entire spectrum of security and intelligence assistance rendered to Ukraine by the U.S. and NATO military forces, with the NATO Center focused primarily on long-term development and the coordination and delivery of donations and security materials, and I'm quoting there. Astoundingly, the New York Times actually ran a relatively decent piece on March 30th of this year discussing the quote-unquote secret relationship between the U.S. military and Ukraine made possible by the activities of various NATO intelligence actors inside Army Garrison Wiesbaden. And the Times even reported that it was at Wiesbaden where U.S. and Ukrainian military officers would meet jointly between 2022 and mid-2023 to set what were called daily targeting priorities, specifically how to target Russian units, pieces of equipment, or infrastructure. From the article, quote, American and coalition intelligence officers would search satellite imagery, radio emissions, and intercepted communications to find the Russian positions. The Army's Task Force Dragon then gave the Ukrainians the coordinates so they could fire at them. In the war's first year, the Ukrainians were extremely dependent on the Americans for intelligence, and Task Force Dragon vetted and oversaw virtually every HIMARS strike against Russian targets, end quote. So in other words, Patriots, factional parts of U.S. Army Europe, along with U.S. intelligentsia operators at Wiesbaden Army Base in Germany, may or may not have been aware of international biological terrorism activities in Europe as early as 2014, but they were absolutely aware of and participating in live-fire combat strikes against the Russian military at both the planning and execution stages immediately after the Ukraine conflict escalated into a full-blown war in February of 2022. I contend with you that this is another major reason why Secretary Driscoll chose Wiesbaden as his first overseas trip, and it seems almost juvenile to point out that we cannot possibly have a productive or fruitful dialogue with Russia, or any other European power for that matter, if Putin's advisors are informing him that rogue U.S. military sections are still doing today what the Times reported they were doing in 2022 and 2023, something that 80 years ago would have resulted in full-scale air raids against domestic U.S. cities in response. Another reason for Wiesbaden Base being Secretary Driscoll's first overseas visit can be summed up in two short words: Ryan Routh. I'm willing to bet all of you remember July 13 of last year, where President Trump was nearly killed by an assassin's bullet in Pennsylvania. But with the gravitas of that event, it's easy to forget that another assassination attempt came not long after that and much closer to President Trump's own home while he was golfing. Mr. Routh was able to evade perimeter security measures in place to protect the president, while lugging a large caliber rifle on his person, and lied in wait for him on the very edge of the golf course property for more than 10 hours. So, Patriots, if you didn't already know, that kind of thing just does not happen without state actor assistance. And it was not long after that, it was not long after he was apprehended by Secret Service agents that it was discovered Mr. Routh had a long and intimate history with the Ukrainian Security Service, as well as a demonstrated record of peddling support for their war effort. How many of you out there know, though, that Mr. Routh also has a fascinating history with none other than the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, aka the same bureau that U.S. Army Secretary Driscoll now oversees? That history actually goes all of the way back to 2002, when Routh was arrested in Greensboro, North Carolina, for threatening one of the Hispanic laborers who worked for him at his business United Roofing, after the man asked Routh for his paycheck, and then he subsequently hit him with his car door while fleeing the scene. Routh was arrested 10 days later on April 23, 2002, and while in jail for the offense, he phoned out to a confidant who was also an employee and instructed him to remove several homemade explosives from their place of business. One day later, Greensboro police received a tip from a confidential informant, in all likelihood probably a jailhouse snitch, that Routh possessed explosive devices. The informant advised that the devices were kept at Routh's business and that they were getting picked up by one of Routh's employees. Greensboro police put out an APB for the employee and quickly located him, and he was indeed in possession of several amateur explosive devices complete with, quote, red cylindrical tube shapes, distinct blasting caps, and detonation wire, end quote. Greensboro PD contacted the local bomb squad, who rendered the devices inoperable, and who informed police that the blasting power contained within them was equivalent to one stick of dynamite each. The employee also told the officers that Routh had shown him an additional device 10 to 15 days prior to these events, which he did not know the location of, but no other devices were located by Greensboro police. At the conclusion of the initial investigation, Greensboro turned the case over to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to determine if any federal violations had occurred. Routh was later released on bond and went about 5 months before being arrested by Greensboro PD again on December 16, 2002, when he was pulled over for a traffic stop and found to be in possession of a machine gun. Routh fled the officer, drove to United Roofing, and barricaded himself inside for hours before eventually being arrested. One day later, on the 17th of December, the local prosecutor moved to revoke Routh's April bond from earlier that year, but Superior Court Judge Peter McHugh declined to do so, instead modifying the bond up to $100,000 and adding provisions that Routh would be barred from driving or possessing any weapons and would also undergo random warrantless searches of both his person and his property. Then, Patriots, just 2 days later, through a sweetheart plea deal that defies all logic, Routh was given 5 years supervised probation. Over the next 20-plus years after that, Routh had several more run-ins with the law, including possession of stolen goods, but managed to avoid prison time until he was caught on the edge of Donald Trump's golf outing. So, Patriots, I'm just going to ask each of you, is it possible and conceivable that at some level, Routh may have found himself either blackmailed or otherwise controlled by assets inside the U.S. administrative deep state, such as a scenario where retroactive legal charges which have not already had a day in court could be brought by any number of agencies, at a later time? Let's add to that possibility that if that premise is possible, and we know that the U.S. intelligence apparatus is heavily cooperative with the U.S. domestic agencies, and we also have photographic evidence of Routh in Ukraine meeting with Ukrainian soldiers and communicating with Ukrainian personnel via telegram, and we now add that the U.S. CIA also created a publicly visible telegram presence in May of 2023, the picture that begins to come together is that Routh's actions from September of 2024 may very well point to a history of participation in black market arms dealing or the trading of U.S. domestic national security information and intelligence like locations of government installations, which could make him an authorized target of both civilian and military investigative efforts. Additionally, how exactly did Routh know when President Trump was going to be participating in a private leisure activity? And for that matter, how did he know where that activity was going to occur 12 hours prior? These questions deserve answers. And a final thought on Routh. Is it possible that ATF records on him contained pertinent or relevant information to the modern-day efforts of mapping, tagging, exposing, and then destroying the structural beams inside subversive Western world security apparatuses writ large. I am here to suggest, Patriots, that this is at the very least a possible explanation for these events. To add some icing to this line of thinking, just 21 days later, to the day after Secretary Driscoll arrived in Germany, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, an agency named as a, quote, cooperative law enforcement organization, end quote, inside FEMA's federal continuity directives, arrested 2 Ukrainian nationals for illegally voting in the 2024 presidential election. Over these last few days, we've now seen scores more Ukrainians arrested for the same crime. How many of these will eventually tie back to the intelligence services is nearly impossible to guess, but in the world of statecraft, I can say with relative certainty that the answer is not 0. You know, Patriots, the sheer scale of the spiderweb worldwide is breathtaking to think about. On the financial and economic side alone, for example, the Rothschild central banks have controlled monetary policy and thus the operating government activities, including military and security, of more than 200 countries for over a century, and maintained this control right up until the inauguration of President Trump in January of 2017. A perspective-inducing question, Patriots, would be to ask just how much corruption 200 countries can generate over a period of 100 years if they all report to the same masters, and if those masters have essentially limitless financial and material resources at their disposal. Obviously, the answer is a whole heck of a lot, and this was the real-world layout on the planet-wide chessboard when Patriots regained control of the major levers of power under the first Trump presidency. Before we move on, let's take a quick moment and hear a word from GDR Labs, the very first partner to the Q News Patriot Audio File series. I'll be back with each of you right after this. If you're a listener of Q News Patriot, you understand better than most the sheer extent of manipulation and deception in our so-called healthcare system, a system that has historically been questionable with things like chronic diseases or conditions like daily pain. Big Pharma knows there's no money for them in pain relief or cures, which is why we have a society hooked now on never-ending narcotic therapies that make them billions of dollars a year. A huge part of pharma's big lie, though, is that other methods of relief from discomfort or ailments do exist. One such solution are naturally occurring alkaloid therapeutics, which stimulate the human brain's innate ability to release natural opioid peptides like endorphins, giving you 100% all-natural pain relief while using your body's regular anatomical design and equipment to do it. There are several kinds of alkaloids on the market, but none like Game Day Ready Labs' Quinolidine liquid supplement, a proprietary breakthrough that uses clinical strength alkaloids to stimulate the good-feeling transmitters inside your brain and nervous system for less than 10% of what traditional pharma-driven pain management would cost. Each bottle is proudly made in the USA in GDR Labs' Atlanta, Georgia facility. Additionally, by avoiding synthetic stimulation of the brain's pain relief centers, quinolidine users don't develop dependency or addiction, nor do they have to see expensive specialists for things like injections. Last year, GDR Labs shipped quinolidine to more than 2 million satisfied customers, and if ordered by midnight tonight, listeners of Q News Patriot can get their own bottle completely risk-free for 90 days at the special price of just $1 per day. No subscriptions required, no gimmicks or bait switching, just powerful relief from the nation's only quinolidine manufacturer. Try quinolidine risk-free for 90 days by visiting www.trycono.com/QNP or click the link in the description box to learn more. Once again, that is www.trycono.com/QNP or click the link below. The only thing you have to lose is your pain. Another major area of irregular warfare that I'm convinced is going to be relevant to our future very soon, Patriots, is this issue of territorial administration and national security inside the Western Hemisphere. We've seen President Trump purposefully make this area a focal point of discussion over the last 18 months, and with the demonstrated actions of the administration in the most recent 100 days, I think we can all agree that this very purposeful public narrative is going to expand greatly in detail and include historic changes before we hit 2028. In my opinion, Trump is laying the groundwork for permanently enhancing the reach and scope of U.S. law in this corner of the world, which will ultimately empower civilian authorities and the U.S. military to take a much more forward-facing and active approach in the protection of Americans in places like the Caribbean, Latin America, the North Atlantic, the Bering Straits, and the Canadian Arctic Circle. And I am here to tell you, Patriots, that the next major move from the Trump government concerning this specific topic may be to offer U.S. protectorate status or outright statehood to the island nation of Cuba. This might sound crazy, but let's look at things from a high-level, unusual warfare lens. Not only does the U.S. military already have a dedicated presence on the island, but Cuba itself has a more than 70-year history of being extremely vulnerable to revolutionary activities and foreign-supported insurgencies against their own internal government. And our U.S. CIA basically proved this point in front of the whole world in the mid-20th century with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs fiasco. When you add in the astonishing drug trade that later emerged off of the island in the last half of the 20th century as its own domestic population sank into poverty, and this is all the confirmation we need for who has really been running Cuba for decades. Additionally, the island nation sports a large sex trafficking and labor exploitation presence, especially in the construction and tourism industries, and prostitution there is legal, which provides a bit of a prima facie insulation against law enforcement for any street gang pimp who might be using underage or trafficked sex slaves for financial gain. Additionally, Cuban authorities are regularly accused of forcing or coercing domestic professionals into using labor slaves from the island's vast labor exploitation markets for their own workforces. This domestic slave labor ecosystem has links with several hotbeds of a larger Latin American black market of human smuggling and trafficking, which is located mainly in the South American countries of Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile, as well as Colombia and the Central American country of Panama. Lastly, Patriots, when we talk about the idea of jurisdiction, Cuba plays host to the U.S. military installation Guantanamo Bay, built on something called the American Exclusivity Zone, which the U.S. secured in the Treaty of 1903 by way of an indefinite lease agreement for the land, and 20 years later, the 1934 U.S.-Cuba Relations Treaty added further language that gave the military, quote, complete jurisdiction and control, end quote, inside the base and on its property. However, by the same treaty, Cuba is also recognized as retaining ultimate and final sovereignty over the soil beneath the installation itself, and it is not inconceivable that the Cuban government could, at some point in the future, decide to evict the U.S. military from the island by invoking these rights, which would present President Trump with the options of either pulling the military's activities off of the island and closing Guantanamo, or potentially conquering Cuba by force. And this also begs the question, Patriots, of what would actually happen if the entrenched deep state crime syndicates on the island were able to arm twist the government into doing exactly that, either immediately prior to or even during scheduled U.S. military war crimes commissions at Guantanamo Bay for domestic bioterrorists like Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, or others. While the answer to that hypothetical is way above my pay grade, I think each of you can see where I'm going with this. When all of the variables with Cuba are accounted for, and in consideration of the broader mission to secure the U.S. homeland permanently and stamp out militarized organized crime in this hemisphere, it is both practical, logical, and economically beneficial to all parties for President Trump to approach Cuba in the same fashion that he is currently approaching Canada and Greenland. You know, with all of what we've gone over just so far on our file today, Patriots, I'd ask each of you to remember that just because we aren't receiving blow-by-blow updates on backdoor machinations happening under the current Trump term, it does not suggest for a moment that these shifts are not occurring at all. We've talked many times before, for example, about the transformations happening inside worldwide commerce and finance markets, and about how that process is underway nation by nation all over the earth, kicking off with the U.S. government's 2018 seizure of the vast wealth holdings kept in the vaults of the Vatican tunnels. It takes significant time to reorient the behavior of governments and the societal constructs that inform and facilitate value exchange across international boundary lines, and we are now entering into a worldwide phase in this process that I'd like to term mass public rollout. Before I jump into my current research on this, I do want to acknowledge that many of us out there have heard this term almost weekly over the last 3 to 5 years, and clearly we are where we are in this day and time. But I would submit to each of you that these last few years are really better labeled historically as the public awareness start, since the general population only began to realize after the Biden body double took office that long-standing financial and economic centers of power inside the NATO world were being squeezed to their breaking points and in some cases being outright removed. With the simultaneous emergence of multiple economic regional zones like the African Union and the BRICS nations as self-sustaining blocs, and new geopolitical alignments like China and Russia or Indonesia and India, the public began to realize that the practices traditionally used to do business inside world markets were coming to an end, which has led directly to the wide-open discourse we've all watched online over the last 18 to 24 months regarding who would ultimately design and then implement the next worldwide monetary trade system. This show has suggested from day one that Patriots have been in control of this particular domain and process since Donald Trump's first 2016 election victory over the Clinton crime syndicate in the United States. And in my opinion, we are now at the point where a public rollout not only makes sense for purposes of leaving a proper legacy for President Trump, but is also practical to ballast and hedge those of us here in the former Commonwealth realms against some of the bumps that are still yet to come in our mission to return wealth and power to the people. It is my belief, Patriots, that these bumps are lapping at our doorstep, with more than 1,000 domestic U.S. banks closing their branch offices in 2024 alone, and with Chase Bank, TD Bank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America closing a further 300-plus locations in just the first quarter of this year, according to figures taken from the U.S. Currency Comptroller Office. Also worth noting is that U.S. Bank itself currently plans at least 35 more closures of its own locations this year, and we aren't even to Mother's Day yet, and this is all happening right alongside the death of the Vatican figurehead Pope Francis and President Trump's recent Oval Office remarks about Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, where he said he is, quote, not very good, and if I want him to go, he'll go, end quote. For a little bit of perspective, Patriots, every president between 1913 and 2017 was required to kiss the ring of the worldwide central banking cabal to even have a chance of ascending to the presidency. And this fealty had to continue just to avoid being forced out of office in disgrace or assassinated. So the fact that President Trump is now coming right out and hinting at presidential authority over the Fed, this is, in my opinion, our indication that the Fed is now officially and mechanically subservient to the Treasury, whose secretary sits within the president's cabinet, and the permanent and public absorption of the former into the latter is likely imminent as we look towards the summer and fall of 2025. Additionally, Q told us way back in 2018 that it would be gold that would destroy the Fed. And based on just the 2025 activity of the U.S. Treasury, the London Bullion Exchange, and European private metal dealers like Pomp Suisse Mint, it is manifestly apparent to me that the movement of hard assets around the NATO nations in particular has accelerated dramatically and is being driven not by temporary market sentiments, but rather by a deep sense of urgency that suggests systemic and foundational changes used for assigning and assessing real value are right around the corner. These changes, which have been underway for more than 8 years, will eventually result in a level of domestic prosperity both for the USA and all nations around the world not experienced by humanity for an age. I know we've covered a great deal today, Patriots, and if you're still with me here at the end of this audio file, let me say again that I am deeply encouraged by where we stand, both as a people and as one humanity around this beautiful earth, despite the terrain that we still have yet to cross in the ongoing and expanding awakening journey. From the meteoric rise of X to the Western world's #1 news source, to Trump's successful inauguration and wildly impactful first 100 days here in 2025, it's clear that the hellhounds of this war ride not against us, but with us. And each day, more and more of our brothers and sisters are discovering their own inner journey, what it means to be a patriot, and what it means to be fearfully made in the image of Almighty God. As we close off our talk today, Patriots, I would ask each of you to really reflect on that fact. You are the spitting image of the divine, equipped with a direct soul connection to the same, and sent to this earth for the purpose of understanding what went wrong throughout our history and how it can be permanently fixed for our posterity. We have always been the rightful caretakers and stewards of these lands, these waters, and this beautiful planet, and the flora and fauna upon it are depending on us to see this process through. I was recently reminded of this by a rather peculiar and abnormally close-up visit from a courageous and hilarious squirrel, as my kiddo played on the park playground a few dozen yards away. To me, the message was clear. We are tasked with restoring the original balance of this world to that which was given to us in the garden of old, and together, arm in arm, and shoulder to shoulder, we will eradicate evil and etch into the annals of all time the greatest victory of good over evil since the stone rolled away from the tomb. I'm looking forward to enjoying that victory publicly with each of you. This is SGAnon. I'll be back with each and every one of you again soon on the Q News Patriot Rumble. God bless everybody. Stay safe today. Thanks. Bye-bye.